The captain's voice crackled over the intercom with an authority that brooked no argument, cold and final, as he announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a security concern that requires us to return to the gate. All passengers, please remain seated while we address this situation." Agent Devon Matthews felt every eye in the cabin turn toward him as the plane that had been taxiing toward the runway began making a U-turn back to the terminal, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was the security concern the captain was referencing. Knew it from the way the flight attendants had been whispering and staring at him since boarding. Knew it from the suspicious glances other passengers had been shooting his way. Knew it because in his 15 years as an FBI agent, he'd learned to recognize the specific quality of attention that came when people looked at a black man in a suit and decided he must be a threat rather than a federal law enforcement officer. Devon had boarded the flight from Atlanta to D.C. without incident, had taken his seat in first class using the upgrade his status had earned through countless work trips, had pulled out his laptop to review case files for the Monday morning briefing he was flying back to attend, and had been settling in for the routine 2-hour flight when a flight attendant had approached and asked to see his boarding pass, then asked to see it again, then disappeared to the front of the plane for a whispered consultation with her colleagues before the captain himself had emerged from the cockpit. Captain Richard Foster had looked Devon up and down with barely concealed hostility, his eyes lingering on Devon's dark skin and the way his broad shoulders filled out his tailored suit. And he'd said in a voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Sir, I need you to come with me to the front of the aircraft. There are some questions about your ticket that need to be resolved before we can depart." Devon had remained calm, had explained that his ticket was legitimate and offered to show additional identification, but Captain Foster had cut him off with a dismissive wave. "I'm the captain of this aircraft, and I make the final decisions about who flies on my plane, and I have concerns about your presence that need to be addressed before takeoff. Now you can either come with me voluntarily, or I can have you removed by security. Your choice." The implication was clear, unmistakable, wrapped in the language of safety and security, but revealing nothing except Captain Foster's own prejudices. His assumption that a black man in first class represented a problem that needed to be solved, rather than a passenger who'd paid for a seat like everyone else. Devon had recognized the futility of arguing with someone who'd already decided what story he was telling himself, so he'd stood and followed Captain Foster to the front of the plane, feeling the weight of every passenger's stare, hearing the whispers that followed in his wake, knowing that his professional reputation and his personal dignity were about to be tested in front of an audience that had already decided he must have done something to warrant this treatment. Captain Foster had led him to the galley area where 2 other crew members stood like reinforcements, and his voice had taken on that particular tone that people use when they believe they're being reasonable while doing something utterly unreasonable. "Sir, your ticket shows a last-minute upgrade to first class. You're traveling alone with minimal luggage, and frankly, you fit a profile that raises security concerns. So I'm going to need you to deplane and go through additional screening before I can allow you back on this aircraft. This is standard procedure and nothing personal." Devon had felt rage building in his chest, hot and familiar, the rage that came from being treated as suspicious for existing, for occupying space, for having the audacity to succeed and travel comfortably while black. But he'd also felt something else, a cold calculation about how to handle this situation in a way that would create lasting accountability rather than just personal vindication. Devon reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, making sure his movements were visible and non-threatening, because he understood that any sudden motion could be interpreted as aggression and used to justify whatever treatment Captain Foster had already decided to inflict, and he pulled out a leather credential holder that he flipped open to reveal his FBI badge and identification card. Captain Foster, my name is Special Agent Devin Matthews. I'm assigned to the FBI Civil Rights Division, and I'm traveling to D.C. for a briefing on airline discrimination cases that my team is currently investigating, which now includes this airline thanks to your actions today. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ambient noise of the aircraft systems, and Devin watched Captain Foster's face cycle through emotions too quickly to catalog. Shock, disbelief, fear, anger, and finally a desperate scrambling for some justification that would make his actions seem less like racial profiling and more like reasonable security measures. I didn't know you were FBI. If you just identified yourself earlier, we could have avoided this whole situation, Captain Foster stammered. But Devin cut him off with a look that had made hardened criminals reconsider their life choices. I shouldn't have to identify myself as a federal agent to be treated with basic respect and dignity. I'm a paying passenger with valid documentation who you decided was a security threat based purely on the color of my skin. And the fact that you're only backing down now because of my badge, rather than because you recognize you are wrong, tells me everything I need to know about your actual values. The flight attendants had gone pale, clearly understanding that they were now part of an incident that was going to have serious consequences, and Captain Foster was opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, trying to find words that would somehow undo what had just happened. Devin pulled out his phone and placed a call that connected on the first ring, and when he spoke, his voice carried the formal precision of someone documenting evidence for a case file. This is Special Agent Matthews, badge number 74392. I'm currently on flight 2847 from Atlanta to Reagan National, and I need to report an incident of apparent racial discrimination by the flight crew. Specifically, the captain refused to allow me to remain on the aircraft after boarding despite having valid documentation, cited vague security concerns that he was unable to articulate with any specificity, and only reversed his position after I identified myself as a federal agent. I'm requesting that TSA and airport police respond to the gate to document this incident and interview witnesses. He listened for a moment, then added, "Yes, I want the cabin surveillance footage preserved. I want statements from all crew members involved, and I want the passenger manifest because I have reason to believe that my treatment was different from other passengers in first class who happen to be white." As Devin ended the call, Captain Foster seemed to find his voice again, but now it carried a wheedling, desperate quality that made Devin's jaw clench with disgust. "Agent Matthews, surely we can resolve this without involving authorities. It was an honest mistake, just a misunderstanding. There's no need to make a federal case out of this." Devin's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Captain, you literally just tried to remove a federal agent from your aircraft because you didn't like the way he looked, and you did it in front of dozens of witnesses who are probably recording this conversation on their phones right now. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a textbook case of discrimination that happens to have been directed at someone with the knowledge, authority, and resources to ensure there are actual consequences." By the time the plane reached the gate, there was already a significant presence waiting. Airport police, TSA supervisors, and two men in suits that Devin recognized as being from the FBI's Atlanta field office. One of them, a senior agent named Rodriguez, who Devin had worked with on previous cases, approached with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal anger at seeing a colleague treated this way. "Devin, you okay? We got the call about a civil rights incident involving one of ours and came immediately." Devin nodded, his jaw still tight with controlled fury. "I'm fine, frustrated as hell, but fine. What I need is for this to be documented thoroughly because I guarantee you I'm not the first black passenger Captain Foster has profiled and removed from his aircraft, and I want every single incident from his career reviewed." Over the next 2 hours, while the flight was canceled and passengers were rebooked on other carriers with profuse apologies and compensation, Devin gave a detailed statement to investigators, watched as Captain Foster and the flight attendants were interviewed separately, and felt a grim satisfaction when he learned that multiple passengers had indeed recorded portions of the incident and were volunteering their footage as evidence. One passenger, a white woman in her 60s who'd been seated across the aisle from Devon, approached him with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm so sorry you had to experience that. I've been flying for 40 years, and I watched that captain question you in a way I've never seen him question any other first-class passenger. It was shameful, and you handled it with more grace than he deserved." Another passenger, a young black man who'd been sitting in economy, pulled Devon aside and said quietly, "Thank you for not letting this slide. I've been pulled aside for extra screening on almost every flight I've taken this year, and I never knew how to fight back. Seeing you stand up to them gives me hope that maybe things can actually change." As Devon finally boarded a different flight 3 hours later, this time with the airline's CEO personally apologizing and upgrading him to a private first-class suite with every amenity they could offer, he thought about how this moment would ripple outward. The investigation he'd triggered would review years of Captain Foster's employment records, would examine patterns in who got questioned and who didn't, would likely uncover a history of discrimination that the airline had ignored or covered up, and would result in policy changes, mandatory training, and potentially criminal charges if the evidence supported it. But more than that, the dozens of passengers who'd witnessed what happened would carry that story with them, would think twice before assuming that a black passenger being questioned must have done something wrong, would maybe, just maybe, start to recognize racial profiling when they saw it and speak up instead of looking away. What you just witnessed wasn't an isolated incident or an honest mistake. It was a window into the systematic racism that exists in every industry, including aviation, where people of color are routinely treated as threats, as problems, as suspicious characters who need to justify their presence in spaces that white passengers occupy without question. Devon Matthews is an FBI agent with 15 years of distinguished service. He holds a law degree and multiple commendations for his work on civil rights cases, and he still couldn't board a plane without a captain deciding he was a security risk based purely on racist assumptions about what threatening looks like. Think about what that means. Think about how Captain Foster looked at Devon's suit and his first-class seat and his minimal luggage and somehow translated all of that into a security concern that warranted removing him from the aircraft. And then ask yourself what evidence he actually had beyond Devon being black. The answer is none. There was no evidence. There was only bias, dressed up in the language of safety and security. Only prejudice wrapped in the authority of a captain's discretion about who flies on his plane. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. Captain Foster only backed down when he learned Devon was FBI, which means he wasn't sorry for racially profiling a passenger. He was scared of profiling someone with the power to create consequences. And that distinction reveals everything about whether his behavior will actually change or whether he'll just be more careful about targeting people who can't fight back. The devastating reality is that Devon had the knowledge, resources, and authority to turn this incident into a full-scale investigation that will likely end Captain Foster's career and force the airline to implement real reforms. But most passengers who experience this kind of discrimination don't have those advantages. They file complaints that get buried, they accept vouchers as compensation for humiliation, they internalize the message that they don't belong in premium cabins or that their presence will always be questioned. And the Captain Fosters of the world continue their careers unchallenged because institutions prioritize avoiding conflict over protecting the dignity of passengers of color. If this story made you angry, if you felt that protective fury when Devon was removed from his seat, and that satisfaction when he revealed his badge, then use that anger productively to examine your own assumptions about who looks suspicious, who belongs in first class, who deserves the benefit of the doubt. Share this video because it illustrates that success and credentials don't protect people of color from racism. They just change the context in which discrimination occurs and occasionally provide tools to fight back. Comment below with your own experiences of being profiled or treated as suspicious without cause, or times when you witnessed others being unfairly targeted by authority figures, because documenting these patterns across contexts and industries builds the evidence base we need to demand systemic change. Subscribe if you believe that amplifying stories of both injustice and accountability can shift how institutions think about bias and discrimination. If you want to see more content that challenges the comfortable fiction that racism is just isolated incidents rather than systematic patterns, if you think the next generation deserves to travel and work and exist without constantly having to prove they have a right to the spaces they occupy, and most importantly, if you witness someone being profiled or discriminated against, be like the passengers who recorded Devon's treatment and volunteered their footage as evidence. Be the person who speaks up and says, "This isn't right." Be the one who refuses to look away when authority figures abuse their power based on racial bias. Devon will spend the next months or years pursuing this case and pushing for reforms, but lasting change requires all of us to recognize discrimination when we see it and to refuse to be silent bystanders who enable it through our inaction.